When we think of a genius, what comes to mind? Probably some lone figure struck by a bolt of lightning, creating something totally new out of thin air, right? But what if I told you that the great masters of the Renaissance, we're talking Michelangelo, Leonardo, the greats, had a totally different idea of what invention even meant? What if their genius wasn't just born? What if it was built piece by piece through a process we've pretty much forgotten?
So that's the big question, isn't it? How did they pull it off? How did these artists go from being just another kid in a workshop to becoming these towering figures we still talk about 500 years later? Was it really just raw, God-given talent? Well, if you ask them, they'd give you a much more practical and honestly, a way more interesting answer. It all started with something like this: a young person, a piece of paper, and the simple act of drawing. But look, this wasn't just doodling for fun. This was the absolute bedrock of their entire education. The journey to becoming a genius began with imitation, or as they called it, mimesis. It's this idea of learning by copying, and they had a very, very specific formula for it. So where did this formula come from? Well, lucky for us, they wrote it down. There's this amazing handbook for artists from the 14th century that just lays it all out. And it starts with what the author called the triumphal gateway. Sounds pretty important, right? Okay, listen to the words Cennino Cennini uses here. He doesn't just say, hey, it's a good idea to draw from nature. No way. He calls it the most perfect steersman, the best helm. It's like he's saying, if you want to steer the ship of your career, this is the only way to do it. For him, this was totally non-negotiable. Step one, before anything else, was to look at the world and copy it as perfectly as you possibly could. So what did that actually look like day to day? I mean, what does this intense, almost obsessive copying of nature actually produce? Well, we can see it for ourselves in the drawings of a master like Pisanello. Just look at these boars. This is not some quick sketch. This is a deep dive. Pisanello is studying the texture of that coarse hair, the sheer weight of the animal, the specific way its muscles tense up. He's training his hand and his eye to be a perfect mirror, to capture the honest truth of the natural world. And then he turns that exact same skill to people. The same rigorous observation he used on an animal is now being used to capture the totally unique profile of Emperor Sigismund. This ability to really see and record reality was like the fundamental currency for a Renaissance artist. It was everything. Okay, so is that the whole story? Was the secret to genius just being a human photocopier? Not even close. In fact, this is where it gets really wild. Renaissance artists believed there was a source of inspiration that was even better than nature itself. And this brings us to the second pillar of their training. This belief that the art of ancient Greece and Rome was basically a perfected, idealized version of nature. And to study it, you had to go to the source. I want you to just imagine being a young artist making the trip to Rome. You're not there as a tourist. The city's ancient ruins, like the Roman Forum you see right here, they were your classroom. This was a gigantic open-air library of sculptures and buildings, and your job was to sit down and copy, copy, copy. But why? Why copy a bunch of old statues? The great art historian, Giorgio Vasari, he explains it perfectly. The thinking was that the ancient masters had already done the hard work for you. They had looked at thousands of real people and combined all their most beautiful parts into one perfect ideal form. So why would you copy one imperfect living person when you could learn from a statue that was already the best of the best? And here is the proof, plain as day. On the right, you've got this famous ancient Roman bronze, the Spinario. And on the left, a drawing from the 1450s, meticulously copying it. The artist isn't just learning anatomy here, they're literally absorbing an ideal of beauty, of proportion, of grace, directly from the ancients. So by now, an artist had two main sources to imitate. You have nature, which is real and beautiful in its imperfection. And then you have antiquity, which was seen as ideal and theoretically perfect. But there was one final, crucial source they turned to, and that was each other. And honestly, this might be the most surprising part for us today. Artists didn't just study the distant past. They studied their recent past, sharpening their skills by directly copying the work of the masters who came just before them. And if you're thinking, oh, that was probably just for the less talented artists, think again. The ultimate Renaissance genius, Michelangelo himself, began his career doing the exact same thing, humbled himself before the work of an older master, and just copied it. Check out this incredible comparison. On the left, that's a drawing by a teenaged Michelangelo. And on the right, that's his source material. It's a chunk of a fresco painted over 150 years earlier by the great Giotto. Michelangelo is literally teaching himself everything: composition, how to draw fabric, how to show emotion, by tracing the footsteps of a master.
Now, today, we'd call this plagiarism, right? But in the Renaissance, it was the exact opposite. It was a sign of deep respect. It was a super practical way to absorb really complex lessons about art. And maybe most importantly, it was how you joined a great artistic tradition. It was how you added your own voice to a conversation that had been going on for centuries. So when we start to bring these three things together, nature, antiquity, and the masters, we get a completely different definition of invention than the one we have now.
This was it. This was their path to genius. It was about mastering these three pillars of imitation. First, you learn to see and draw the real world around you. Second, you learn what ideal beauty looks like from classical art. And third, you learn the secrets of the craft from the masters who came right before you.
And this gets us to the true meaning of mimesis. It wasn't about being a mindless copycat. It was about a creative synthesis. The whole goal was to absorb all these sources so deeply that you could start combining them in a new way, to forge a style that was built on everything that came before, but was still uniquely your own.
So you see, the idea of a lone genius creating something out of nothing, it would have seemed totally bizarre to a Renaissance artist. For them, true invention was the art of seeing everything, selecting the best parts from nature, from antiquity, from tradition, and then putting them all together into something new and more powerful. Genius wasn't in the blank page, it was in the masterful combination.
Which kind of leaves us with a huge question for today, doesn't it? Does this change how we look at creativity? I mean, think about musicians who sample old songs, or coders who build on open source projects, or writers who are influenced by their heroes. Is anything ever truly 100% original? Or are we all, in our own way, just practicing a modern kind of mimesis?